Good evening, good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. My name is Minran Liu from Sydney University's China Studies Center. I'm also a lecturer in international political studies at the University of New South Wales, Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Thank you for coming to today's event. I will be serving as the chair for this event. This is part of Talks in Chinese Humanities, are co-presented by the China Studies Center, the Discipline of Chinese Studies, and the Australian Society for Asian Humanities at the University of Sydney and the Faculty of Art, Design, and Architecture at UNSW. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the country. I'd like to acknowledge the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodian of the land where we meet and study. I pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. This land has always been and will always be the Aboriginal land. So we are very delighted to have Dr. Kasper Witz here with us today. Kasper Witz is a university lecturer in East Asia Studies at Leiden University from Netherlands. His research focuses on post-war diplomatic and international history in East Asia, with a special interest in development of Chinese and Japanese foreign policy and the Sino-Japanese relations in the period. Before coming to Leiden, he was a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Cambridge and a lecturer at the University of Tübingen. This talk will focus on the work of Xinhua's foreign correspondents during the Cold War, and especially their role as political mediators in the process of China's supposed opening in the 1970s. Often overlooked in the history of this opening in the 1970s are the unique trajectories of Beijing's relations with capitalist nations other than the United States. Focusing on the rapprochement processes with Japan and Western Germany, this talk will aim to bring the full some striking similarities in how the establishment of diplomatic relations with these two countries was realized. A challenge for Beijing was that due to the absence of official relations, there were limited channels for communications about a possible rapprochement, which forced the government to make use of normally non-governmental actors to establish a network of contacts and provide them with accurate information on the countries in question. A major boost for this process was the agreement that the Xinhua News Agency could place permanent foreign correspondents in Tokyo and Bonn in 1964. In this talk, we'll seek to trace the activities of these Chinese journalists and how they were tasked with building a network that had to include influential figures in Japan and West Germany that were not natural sympathizers of the People's Republic of China. There will be a Q&A session. Q&A, please keep the questions as precise and as straightforward as possible. If you like to ask questions, please list them in the Q&A facility at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Dr. Witz Kasper. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thorough and kind introduction. I'm very happy and honored to be here today with you at the University of Sydney. I'll begin with sharing my screen. Let's hope all that works. Okay, so yeah, as was said in the introduction, I will speak today about the activities of the Xinhua News Agency and generally, I would say, Chinese foreign correspondents in Chinese foreign policy during the period, mainly I'll focus 1960s, 1970s. And I will basically thereby shed a light on a period of Chinese foreign policy and Chinese diplomacy that I think was very much focused on winning friends and influencing people. Hence the title of this talk, which, to be honest, is a rather different era of Chinese diplomacy than we are in now, and an era I think that a lot of us maybe are longing for, having some nostalgia for. And this era was, I think, the most central person, as will not be a surprise for many of us, is very much Zhou Enlai, who managed this kind of diplomacy, especially with countries that China did not have diplomatic relations with, in a way that I hope will become a little bit clearer during this presentation. So first of all, when we start this rethinking, as I call it, of China's supposed opening in the 1970s, this is not something new. A lot of scholars have been working on this for quite a few years. And one important work that has been very influential for me has been Emery Brady's work, Making the Foreign Serve China, in which he describes the activities that we refer to as 外学 or 外交事务, which is like literally something like diplomatic matters, and was really about cultivating ties with potential friends of the Chinese outside of the immediate government sphere. So this is this is about countries with which China does not have relations, or at least not like stable diplomatic relations. So maintaining relations with those countries therefore mostly went through back channels. And as Emery Brady says, by creating and making a lot of foreign friends which were not directly members of the government, the Chinese long-term aim was very much to influence the government through those kind of people, and thereby very slowly create a kind of change in that government's attitude to the PRC, basically. So this could be, in the case of Japan, very much with the goal of the long-term break, that Japan would break off relations with the Republic of China and Taiwan and establish relations with the PRC as soon as possible, which was in fact the goal of the Chinese, the PRC government already from the 1950s onwards. In other countries, capitalist nations such as West Germany had relations with neither China, mainland China, nor with Taiwan. So, but there as well, there was great need for kind of back channels in order to maintain some kind of contact and relations with these governments. And what I focus on mostly is that in the beginning of my PhD research, and when I became interested in this topic, I noticed that even though the actual establishment, for example, of diplomatic relations in the 1970s with countries like Japan and West Germany is well understood in the sense of that it happened through these kind of back channels, and that thereby the establishment of those relations were rather smooth and quick. How these back channels actually came about in the years or even decades before that, I think was less well known. And I find this very interesting. Like, how exactly should we picture this? How are back channels actually established? How did the Chinese go about it? Did they have a special method for it, etc.? And a big challenge in establishing these back channels, I very quickly found out, is that, of course, there were not so many Chinese people in those countries loyal to the government in Beijing who could actually function as reliable back channels on the Chinese side. And this is where, first of all, like small business people came in. So business delegations from China, for example, going to Japan or European countries that could provide some kind of back channel. Progressive intellectuals maybe is the most logical one, the one we would most expect, maybe, like intellectuals that were kind of naturally inclined to be somewhat sympathetic to the Chinese government. However, I think one thing that was overlooked until recently is that China did actually and was actually allowed to have foreign correspondents in certain Western countries as well as Japan. And that it was these foreign correspondents that also played a rather central role in maintaining relations unofficially on behalf of the Chinese government with a wide variety of people in those countries. And what I find the most interesting is that from the Chinese government side, and especially Zhou Enlai very much emphasized this. He wanted the Chinese journalists that were placed in, for example, Japan and West Germany, which will be the focus of this talk, with people that were not sort of those natural allies yet. So he didn't really care so much about relations with progressive intellectuals or with labor unionists or whatever. But really much more with people who did not already agree with China, in order to get a well-rounded view of the situation in those countries, as well as you know, the idea that those countries, those people still needed to be influenced, so to speak. And this is a photo of Mao Zedong meeting a German politician called Franz Josef Strauss in 1975. So this is already after the establishment of relations. However, this particular politician was rather important as well before the establishment of relations between the two countries. And interestingly enough, he is known as the most right-wing politician in post-war Germany, you know, at least within reason, like among mainstream politicians, so to speak. So the radical right-wingers aside, he is probably the most conservative, most anti-communist politician in post-war Germany, and very well known for exactly this. So it came as rather a surprise to me that it was exactly this person that played a very central role already from the start of the presence of a Chinese journalist in Germany, and moreover that he was very sympathetic to the idea of having better relations with China. So how all that sort of came about is what I hope to explain in this this talk. So first I'll speak a little bit about how activities of Chinese back channels, especially consisting of journalists, were established with Japan, and then how that model, so to speak, was applied to West Germany a little later. And important moments here are when in Japan in 1964, a group of Chinese foreign correspondents was allowed to move to Tokyo, and in West Germany in 1969, when a grand total of 1 Chinese foreign correspondent moved to Bonn, the then capital of West Germany. So as I started this research, I started collecting a lot of, especially memoirs and biographies, etc., of Chinese journalists that had worked abroad, wherever. And I found actually there's, even though this subject is not that easy to study anymore, especially not in the current circumstances in the last few years with the COVID crisis, etc. But thankfully, there is a habit in China, especially for former journalists, to publish their memoirs. And this is a topic in which, once you start looking, you can actually find a lot of very interesting sources, like collections of books, for example, of foreign correspondents who had been active in Japan, of which I have a lot. And also the previously mentioned foreign correspondent in Germany also has published a number of books as well as articles explaining in great detail how they went about establishing these kind of back channels, you know, and what the work of a Chinese foreign correspondent in the Cold War was actually like. A lot of that information is also about where these journalists or Chinese journalists were mostly placed, which was in communist countries. However, for me, the most interesting examples have been of journalists placed in countries that did not have good relations with China, and how then they went about doing their work and establishing back channels. There has been quite a lot of research done recently in the last few years in sort of rethinking this China's opening in the 1970s. And one example I want to draw your attention to is this edited volume by Angela Romano and Valeria Zanier as editors, who basically gathered together a group of scholars to share their research about mostly trade relations before their countries had proper relations with the PRC in the 1950s and 60s on the European side. So really showing how the breakthrough in China's relations with the supposed capitalist world in the 1970s was not a sudden event that came after Nixon's visit to China. That was something that was a very long, sometimes decades-long process, which was managed in great detail by the Chinese, especially. And one interesting thing that they said is that if we, in their introduction, if we scratch beneath the surface of official diplomatic relations, we can find evidence that the major Western European countries' rapprochement to the PRC had begun already in the 1950s, which I think is very important to keep in mind generally when we think of China's supposedly isolated position before the 1970s. So now a little bit about Japan. You might be aware of the term people's diplomacy or people-to-people diplomacy and its centrality in Chinese foreign policy at this moment, especially with capitalist countries, countries they did not have diplomatic relations with. And I would say in the 1950s, it was still very much like small-scale interaction with people that were generally like positively disposed to liking the PRC. And this meant in Japan very much like Japanese left, obviously the Japan Communist Party and Socialist Party, but also unions, progressive intellectuals, etc. However, from the 1950s onwards already, we see a number of supposedly private trade agreements being signed between the Chinese and supposedly non-governmental trade groups in Japan. And these trade agreements were really rather small, and a lot of research has been done into this. This is quite well known. But I think most important thing here for us is that this led to quite a number of delegations going back and forth. And these delegations in the first few years led to a lot of exchanges between the Chinese and Japanese, leftist politicians and intellectuals. And from the start, however, already we see a number of Chinese journalists also being attached to these delegations. And rather quickly, talk is beginning about whether or not it would be possible to place permanent foreign correspondents in each other's countries, which would have been a major breakthrough because there was still no permanent presence of official Chinese in Japan and vice versa. However, what we'll speak about today is rather different, and the phase, I would say, that starts from the late 1950s. This is really when the emphasis of what the Chinese wanted from all this completely changes, as I will hopefully show you. One very important work, I would say the most important work on Sino-Japanese relations in the period before the establishment of official diplomatic relations, is Amy King's book published in 2016. Amy King is now at ANU, might be familiar to quite a few of you. I highly recommend reading this work for getting a thorough grasp on the history of modern Sino-Japanese relations in the Cold War, mostly focused on business ties, well, economic ties, I would say. And as she says, for Zhou Enlai, Japan was not just a place where one was to have contact with progressives who happen to like Japan already, China already, but he very much saw Japan as a model, also an East Asian model of how technology could be used to modernize the economy and thereby catch up with the West, so to speak. And throughout the 1950s, though, a realization dawned on him and other people in the leadership that they were hampered, in fact, by how they went about relations with Japan, in relying so much on a specific leftist subsection of the Japanese population, which led to a rather biased view in China of what was actually going on with Japan, how Japan went about its economic miracle. So the fact that the Chinese had mostly relations with sympathizers in Japan was actually seen as quite a negative, and something that had to be resolved. So a priority very quickly became how to establish relations with a broader, or how to establish back channels with less biased Japanese and a broader swath of the Japanese population, which was not so easy to go about, I would say. However, will lead over the next decade or so with two, I think, very different priorities in this kind of back channel diplomacy, which was that they went about courting the Japanese and later the West German right. I mean center right. I mean not the extreme right, of course, but generally center right politicians who are much closer to the centers of power generally than their previous more leftist friends had been. So this is the kind of interaction that I will introduce and speak about in detail now. A very central person in all this, I would say, generally in the study of this kind of Weishe, like the unofficial diplomacy that China engaged in, but especially when it comes to Japan, is Liao Zhejie, who was a very central, I would say, back channel figure in Beijing for a number of decades, already long before 1949, and a very close associate of Zhou Enlai, who had himself, he was actually born in Tokyo in 1908, had grown up in Japan and was therefore fluent in Japanese. However, by the 1920s, very late 1920s, he had moved back to China and joined the CCP. And by the 1950s was a central committee member and started managing this kind of unofficial diplomacy first to Japan in great detail with the formation of the Japan Group, the Rubens, in which he gathered a number of Japan hands from different government organs as a kind of a unique task force to take care of this kind of unofficial diplomacy. And they would spend their days analyzing Japanese affairs, first of all, for simply reading a lot of media, but then also for making plans of what kind of Japanese they were intending to, make friends with. Which kind of Japanese friends they wanted to win over, so to speak, on these trade delegations, for example, in which there was opportunity to actually meet with Japanese people. So they would target specific Japanese individuals and analyze to what extent they could be useful for the PRC. And the long-term goal, therefore, was a cultivation of a network of influential people within Japan that would be able to work for China's benefit, but in the end goal was always to establish diplomatic relations with Japan, which would then mean Japan also breaking off diplomatic relations with Taipei. And again, we know this in rather a lot of detail because of this book, which was written by two members of the Japan group who explain in great detail how the education and such went off Japan hands under Liao. And they say that Liao Zhejie very much wanted the Japan hands to focus not only on making progressive friends. In fact, he cared more about making friends with those of the center and center right, or with anti-communist right-wingers, as long as they were not anti-PRC. And thereby isolating the diehard right-wingers. This is not an uncommon idea in Chinese diplomacy generally. I mean, Zhou Enlai had always had this idea of winning over the middle ground, in countries in order to further China's aims. So yeah, the Japan hands were very much focused on this particular aspect. Rather quickly, this kind of activity boomed, I would say, with the establishment of a group of people in the governing party, the Liberal Democratic Party, that is probably familiar to you in Japan, the main sort of party on the center-right conservative side, who from 1958 had a pro-China faction that was heavily supported by business people in Japan, who saw great business opportunities in China, rightfully so, and who also, in fact, felt great annoyance with the fact that Japan only had relations with the ROC in Taiwan, which was the case only because of US pressure in reality, which caused, even among Japanese conservatives, quite a lot of anger. In fact, people who wanted a more independent foreign policy. In any case, the People's Republic of China not having any official representation in Japan was, of course, a great drawback for anyone who wanted to interact with China in any way. So the fact that now the LDP itself had a faction of politicians who maintained close relations with the PRC meant that the leader of this faction, Matsumura Kenzo, very much became China's man in Tokyo. So if business people wanted to learn more about China and probable investment opportunities there, Matsumura would be the man to call. Sadly enough, Matsumura has been largely forgotten, even among people studying Japanese political history. I once visited his hometown, a tiny city in Toyama Prefecture, where there is still like a memorial. I mean, you could sort of call it museum, but it took the municipality quite a long time before they had actually found the key to the memorial. And first they had to find the person responsible for the key of the memorial, and then the key, and then finally, after I think it was already a few hours, they finally could let me into this museum where there was dust on all the books, etc. So this is a rather sad situation because Matsumura Kenzo, I would say, is absolutely the central figure if you want to study Sino-Japanese relations in the Cold War, and is still remembered as such, probably more in China than in Japan. Among Chinese scholars of Japan, they generally do know who he is, and he's still greatly respected among those people. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit, but Matsumura Kenzo was the man to watch, basically. Although sadly enough, he will never see the establishment of diplomatic relations because he'll die in 1971. But around him, he gathers people in the LDP, so center-right and conservative politicians in Japan, who had genuine sympathy for the People's Republic of China, wanted to establish relations with the PRC for a variety of reasons. Some of them for out of a sense of historical contrition, other people more out of interest in engaging in business. Be that as it may, he makes 3 very important visits to Beijing on which he meets the Chinese leadership. So he has meetings with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong and on all those visits. And with him on those visits, he brings very large delegations of Japanese business people and politicians, once again, in order to establish this kind of network in which relations could be managed, even if there were no diplomatic relations yet. The main breakthrough of these visits is the establishment of permanent trade offices in 1964. So I sometimes like to compare this a little bit to the situation that Taiwan is in now with many countries, that it does have, the Taipei Trade Office very often in our countries that functions as kind of unofficial embassy. So this was really a great breakthrough in Japan-China relations in 1964, that for the first time there is official representation in each other's country. However, during these meetings, and it's very easy to just, you can read the whole record either in Chinese or Japanese, and also people engaging in those meetings have often published their memoirs, like Matsumura's secretary, Tagawa Seiichi, who later became a politician himself, who was also a journalist, in fact, who, from his book, he really explains how Matsumura kept emphasizing to Zhou Enlai in these meetings that the views of the Chinese of Japan were simply not correct, because they relied too much on biased Marxist views, basically, and which were reinforced by the Japanese left. Something that actually Zhou Enlai himself had also realized, of course. And Matsumura then says that it would be a good idea if there could be an exchange of journalists as well. which was a good way of countering Zhou Enlai's complaints that there was such an anti-China bias in Japanese media. And Matsumura then said, if we can simply have permanent correspondents in each other's countries, we can work more towards mutual understanding, you know. So yeah, this is a photo of the meeting in 1962 between Zhou Enlai on the left, and you see Matsumura sitting there on the right. One thing I always encourage my students to do is to not only look at the famous people on the photo, but also on who else is on the photo. And very often it is who else is on the photo. That is also going to be a rather interesting source of information about what actually took place. First of all, because a lot of the famous people on the photo are already dead. And if they're not dead, they're probably going to be rather hard to speak to. Often it's the interpreters or the secretaries of the important people you're interested in that are going to be more fruitful sources of information. So yeah, I interviewed the person on the right that you see there. He's called Liu Deyo, one of the main, if not the main translator of Japanese to Chinese in this era. So he was basically the #1 interpreter for the Chinese leadership in this period. Had himself, in fact, grown up in the quote-unquote Manchukuo puppet state, and was absolutely bilingual. Some of you who might have a background in Japan-China relations might actually know this name, because he also, much later in his life, became a famous linguist who has written a lot of the standard works in the study of Japanese for Chinese high schools as well as universities. He was a man of many, or he is in fact a man of many talents. And when the journalist exchange, as it came to be known, was established, he was actually sent to Japan as a journalist. So this is the group of Chinese journalists that were sent to Japan in 1964. And you again see Liu Deyo on the far right of that photo. So it was decided at this moment that 7 Chinese correspondents would go to Tokyo and 9 Japanese to Beijing. And again, Liao's advice to these Chinese journalists will begin to see, or is already familiar to us by now. So he said that when making friends in Japan, you must think ahead. If in your surroundings you only have leftist friends or those who speak well of us, and no rightists or those who speak ill of us, your grasp of the situation is not complete. The more widely you have friends, the more useful it will be for you in establishing a long-term foothold. So yeah, the journalists were very much encouraged to go out and make friends, especially with, the more right-wing Japanese. I'm now going to jump over quite a few of the years after that, because there's a lot, as you can imagine, the changes in China after 1964 with the Cultural Revolution were such that there's a lot more to say about the lives of these correspondents. However, their main breakthrough came in 1972 when, these, especially 2 journalists, so one of them Liu, who I've already introduced, but also Wang Taiping, who was placed in Beijing in 1969, played a very pivotal role in, using their back channels to organize the trip of the Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue to Beijing, which led to the very quick and very smooth establishment of diplomatic relations. So yeah, especially Liu, as you see from the dates, spent a very long time in Beijing, and also probably has, in terms of the timing, I think, is especially rather impeccable, because he managed to miss the entire Cultural Revolution by being in Tokyo. So yeah, I just wanted to give you this as a bit of a background to now move on to West Germany and to show you a situation that was perhaps even more challenging than Japan, in the sense that there was very little institutional knowledge of West Germany in China at that moment. So when a journalist exchange was established in 1964, the first few years, in fact, weren't very eventful until this man was placed in Bonn, which was the capital at the time in West Germany, in 1969. So Wang Shu by that time had already a rather stellar career in foreign correspondence in a number of foreign countries, mostly in the communist world, as you see. Or actually not mostly in the communist world, but mostly in the developing world. So communist countries like Cuba, but also countries like Nepal, Pakistan, Guinea, Ghana, and Mali. Before suddenly being assigned to the FRG, that's West Germany, right? Federal Republic of Germany. And when he arrived in 1969, he spoke no word of German. That would change very quickly. And very quickly, he will set about creating also a network in West Germany, which very much, on principles that are very similar to what we saw in Japan before, which again will lead to a rather smooth establishment of diplomatic relations also in 1972. And Wang Shu does this almost single-handedly, which was rather an impressive achievement. In fact, was also recognized as such in Beijing. And it was, in fact, Mao's idea then to make Wang a ambassador. And he then became the second ambassador to West Germany, later deputy foreign minister, as well as ambassador to Austria. So it's someone who really made the jump from being a journalist to a diplomat and even politician, which is rather common because these two journalists, in fact, did something similar. Wang Taipei will later, in the late 1990s, become the consulate general in Osaka, in Japan, and Liu Deyo will become a deputy minister of culture, I believe, in Beijing. So yeah, more about Wang Shu. In order to understand his activities in Germany as he arrived in 1969, I first have to give you a bit of background of what was going on in West Germany in 1969, which I assume might not be, that well known in Australia. 1969 was the moment when, for the first time, the SPD could form a coalition government, and the main center-right ruling party, which was often the ruling party, the CSU coalition, was not in government for the first time in the post-war, that is. And a very influential figure called Willy Brandt then became the German chancellor. And he is mostly remembered for his so-called Ostpolitik, or Neue Ostpolitik, so the new Eastern policy, in which this SPD government established or pursued much warmer relations with the communist world than Germany had before, than West Germany had before. And this led to a lot of breakthroughs in relations with the Soviet Union. This is a photo of Willy Brandt with, on the far left, Brezhnev and Crimea, in fact, on a visit to the Soviet Union. But the breakthroughs were even more significant in inter-German relations, where this would lead to finally in 1974, actually permanent diplomatic missions being established between West and East Germany. So all this was a major breakthrough, very well known in German history, so Ostpolitik. For our interests, though, as China scholars, people interested in China, will be very much like what China's position was in all this. Like, how did this SPD government, in fact, view potential relations with China? Is not so easy to determine. So when we do this, however, through reading Wang Shu's memoirs, we can get a good idea of it. We see that there was definitely no Fernostpolitik, which would mean Far Eastern policy, in the SPD's thinking. So especially because relations with the Soviet Union were such a priority for the new government, this meant that any relations with China were almost out of the question, obviously, because relations between China and the Soviet Union were so bad at this moment. So yeah, this was one of the reasons. And generally, the idea that Western Europe in general would establish better relations with the Soviet Union was seen as a great threat in Beijing at the time. So they were really rather opposed to this kind of realignment that they saw taking place in Ostpolitik and later the détente as well. which was of course due to its own bad relations with Moscow, as well as its own bad relations with East Berlin. So the East German governments, because of its closeness to Moscow, also had really rather bad relations with China at this moment. I mean, they did have an ambassador in place, but you know, it was a very sensitive situation. So as Wang Shu arrives, not knowing really that much about all this, he very quickly finds that you know, great historical changes are taking place, and that his government is very much opposed to those changes and opposed to this realignment. And he finds a large group in West Germany that is also opposed to this, also opposed to Ostpolitik. However, that group consists of basically people who identify themselves more with center-right politics, and then especially the Christian Democrat coalition, right? That is still very much this duo of parties, the CDU and the CSU. That is still in existence today. For example, Angela Merkel was of the CDU herself. Yeah, so already from the beginning, Zhou Enlai like sort of instructs Wang Shu that these are the people that might be China's potential allies. This was, of course, a very sensitive situation, especially in 1969, because the Cultural Revolution is still going on. And when these kind of things were communicated in Beijing, they in fact had to be very careful in order not to be criticized for being some kind of some kind of counter-revolutionary, you know? So Wang Shu had to go about it in very carefully, also in West Germany, also being very careful about what he telegraphed back to Beijing, you know? In any case, his instructions were rather clear that these were the people that China was interested in mingling with. So mainly like the powerful party that now happened to be in the opposition, the CDU-CSU. And Wang Shu wastes basically no time in courting these kind of conservatives, as well as a lot of people from the German business world, where in fact, the CDU-CSU coalition is kind of, or the grouping of parties is very famous for its ties to German business, which a lot of people actually consider to be a little bit too close and will in fact lead to the downfall of the person you see on the left of this photo, but it's kind of another story. As Wang Shu goes about this and his German improves very quickly, the reception in Bonn really is very enthusiastic, maybe not what you would expect. And very quickly, his house becomes a hub of Sino-German contacts. And we see the top figures from business, politics, and the media that start gathering there. And two figures I want to single out here. First of all is Helmut Kohl, the person on the left of this photo, CDU leader, later Chancellor of Germany, was already very involved with this from the start. The other person is the one I showed you on the photo before already, Franz Josef Strauss, the most right-wing politician in Germany at the time. Basically, these people hated the Soviet Union so much that they really had this attitude of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Therefore, they had great interest in establishing relations with China. Also for business reasons, of course. I mean, German business was very, very keen in getting access to the Chinese market. And this was in the end to lead also to interactions in the 1980s in which we really sees West Germany taking a sort of pioneering position in investment in China. Of course, I probably do not have to make the link too clear now to the present moment, where of course this is a very controversial subject in Germany because they have intertwined their economic relations so much with China. It all has its roots here. In any case, the breakthrough in all this was a visit in 1972 when an opposition politician, Gerhard Schröder, former foreign minister, now parliamentarian for the CDU, is chosen or invited by Wang Shu, or it's actually Zhou Enlai's idea, for visiting China with a party delegation. So this is the opposition politicians will be invited to China. And this also put so much pressure on the SPD government that they kind of accept Schröder as an envoy here. And it is, in fact, this opposition opposition diplomacy, as Zhou Enlai himself also would describe it, that then led to negotiations that would lead to a very rapid establishment of diplomatic relations, which was in the end also rather favorable for the SPD. Because of them not having taken this initiative, they could sort of claim to their new friends in the Soviet Union that it's sort of, you know, they had to do it because they were under so much pressure, but it wasn't really their idea to begin with. Oh yeah, again, don't be mistaken, there are two Gerhard Schröders in German politics. This is not the later German chancellor of the SPD, who was chancellor from 1998 to 2005. Same name, different person. This is a CDU politician who was a foreign minister already in the 1960s. Okay, so this again led to this very smooth, very quick establishment of diplomatic relations, which is not something that we could have expected had these back channels not already been established in such a proactive way. So to sum things up, really in the course of 1 month, less than 1 month, in fact, diplomatic relation was achieved with these two countries, which, you know, if we take a very shallow view of foreign relations, we can say that this had a lot to do with Nixon's visit to China. In reality, though, this is really the culmination of years-long activities in the establishment of back channels. And the role of the business world in this, of course, should not be overlooked. However, I do hope I've made my case that digging more deeply into the activities and lives of Chinese foreign correspondents gives us an even broader view of what exactly the principles were in establishing these back channels, which again tells us a lot about why they were so successful, and has a lot to do about the open-mindedness of these journalists as they set about winning friends and influencing people. So yeah, that's my presentation for now, and thank you very much for patient listening.